Welcome to a brand new episode of the School of Whispers podcast. There's a chance I might say this every week, but this episode is a really good one, you guys. It's one of those episodes that while I'm editing it, I'm like, damn, it's just so good. I have to close my eyes too, just to soak it all in. So I'm so excited for it to reach your ears. So this week's guest is the one and only Troy Valencia. Troy is co-founder of Iboga Retreat Center, Root and Wisdom, and co-founder of nonprofit Sacred Roots Foundation. To give you the quickest possible background on Troy, he has his master's in analytical chemistry, his master's in East-West psychology with a special interest in soteriology, the study of liberation, and he's halfway through his doctorate degree in clinical psychology. This man dabbles in all the things. He's also a published author. He's an American holistic transformational coach. He's a certified sound healer. I mean, the man's got his own Spotify, which I will link in the show notes because I listen to his albums, especially the Sounds of Medicine, all the time. So today on the show, we really get into a special interest of his, which is the liberation from suffering. So on the show, we talk about why do we choose to suffer? We talk about the difference between healing versus remembering. We talk about how Iboga works with the mind and our systems of beliefs. We talk about the three main addictions that Troy has found in his practice, which are suffering, healing, and what I like to call cheap dopamine. We also talk about why and how Troy has reached a point where he has no faith in anything. This is one of my favorite topics that he goes over. This podcast truly is for all human beings, especially those of us who believe that in order to know ourselves and to live the lives that we want, that we need to suffer, or that we need to outsource our quote unquote healing. I believe that the work that Troy and his partner Joe have been doing is revolutionary, and I can say right here, it's changed my entire life. So I'm excited for you to have just a drop of the wonderful world of Troy Valencia. If you would like to connect with Troy, whether that's to chat or to work with him, you can find all of his information in the show notes. Welcome to the School of Whispers podcast. This is your host, Stephanie. I'm a licensed acupuncture physician and herbalist with a background in psychology, health sciences, and exercise physiology. Within my own spiritual awakening, I found myself learning pivotal lessons when I got myself to be in silence. Within that silence, the whispers came through. This is my sacred space of vulnerable storytelling where my guests and I share about the magic that comes from a life of following these whispers. I'm grateful you made it here, and I hope this show inspires you to live a life of following your own whispers. Let's get into the show. Troy, warm welcome to the podcast. So excited to have you here. I want to give you the space to introduce yourself because I feel like there are so many things. I would call you my favorite doctor alien human hybrid. Class 1 drug dealer.
For real.
So yeah, I'll give you the space to introduce yourself in whatever title that you want to give us here.
Yeah, I guess first, just thank you for having me on your podcast. Obviously, we've worked together in a number of ways, and so I just want to honor you for, yeah, what influence this has on the collective, right? 'Cause that's all it's about is helping other people. A title, I couldn't even give you one, but if I had to make one up on the spot, I would just say I am a self-developing inquire of human potential is what I would have to say. If there's a title for anything, is that.
I'll take it. I'll take it. And can you please share your background? Actually, let's just because so I told as I told you before, I really want to talk about suffering. The lessons that you have shared with me that for the past 5, 6 years that you've just thrown your entire being into on suffering has just changed my world in so many ways. And I know that you're kind of like an iceberg that, everything you're sharing is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much below the surface. And, when I think about the story that you shared with me, my God, we could throw you in that category of somebody you have every reason to feel suffering, every reason to, play that game of, oh yeah, well, you got that trauma. Well, listen to my trauma. But that's not the game you play. You're on a whole other stratosphere of that. So yeah, if you could please share about your story of what brought you here to this space of being my resident expert. I think everyone else who's listening, resident expert on suffering and relieving suffering.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Suffering is, it's an interesting thing. If you ever read the book "Man Searches for Meaning" by Viktor Frankl, if anyone has not read that, I would highly recommend it. He was a psychologist and neurologist who is also a Holocaust survivor. And "Man Searches for Meaning" is a exposition of sorts about his experience in the Holocaust and in the concentration camps and sort of what revelations he had. And one of the things he says is that if there's a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. And so the first important thing I think it's very critical to name is that suffering has a place in life. It's a very profound teacher and it's optional. And so it's just really important for people to understand that it's if you are suffering from certain things, that's okay because you're going to learn something from that. But there's a state of awareness in which we can walk towards, which you can learn those same lessons without the suffering, right? And so I just want to start with that in context. I guess if I were to start with my story, yeah, I was raised in the foster system. My biological mother was a sex worker, drug addict, all the things. She actually died from AIDS when I was 3 years old. And so I was raised in the foster system. I was adopted eventually by a beautiful, loving family from the Philippines. Even to this day, I still struggle to pronounce certain words. I'm going to try my best on this one. Like, for example, Houston, I have to try that really hard. I always said Houston because the language in the Philippines, there's no pronunciation of that. So I grew up in a home where people were speaking Tagalog. And I remember on my first day, someone did a backflip off a pool. And I was like, oh, he did a backflip. And everyone was like, what the hell is a pliff? And I was like, what do you mean? So it was a very interesting childhood. I grew up, my mother was Irish. My father was Central African, who I never met until I got that from a genetics test later. But I grew up in a foster home, years of abuse, not just as someone being abused in a foster home, but as the abuser. I played both roles. That was actually the real shame point in my life growing up. I hated myself for that for a number of years. It's something I could never really stand about myself. And yeah, I sort of just grew up disconnected from life. It's how I found science. And in science, there was no feelings. No one asked me how I felt. They just asked me to prove or to disprove a hypothesis. And so I fell in love with chemistry. Because of that, it was very binary. It was ones and zeros. And so I double majored biology, chemistry, got a master's in analytical chemistry, and then went on to work in the field as a chemist and vibrational spectroscopist for 15 years before I had a spiritual awakening. In that awakening, I didn't heal anything, is what's so fascinating about that experience. It wasn't like I went in with some understanding of trauma. I actually didn't know anything. I didn't even know what ayahuasca was when I first came to that medicine. But what happened was I remembered who I was. It's like it was always there. It's why nowadays I don't talk about healing, I talk about remembering, right? Healing implies a lack of wholeness. If you Google it right now, you'll see one of the central definitions is to return to wholeness. So if I say to you, I'm healing, what I'm really saying is I'm not whole. If I say to you, I'm healing and I'm going to go work with ayahuasca to heal, then what I'm really saying to you is I'm not whole. And that's something outside of me, which is ayahuasca, is going to make me whole. It's a very disempowering place to stand when you do this work. So instead, in the work we do, we talk about remembering. Remembering implies that it's always been there. It's simply been forgotten. And so, yeah, growing up, that was sort of my story. I grew up disconnected, found Aya. Aya helped me to remember. About 4 months after returning home from that ayahuasca retreat, I came back to a completely new world, the same San Diego, but a different layer to it. I could see the trees in a whole new way. I can hear the birds. It was just a different life experience I had. And I received a text from a woman. She said, "Hey, Troy, my name's so-and-so. I was on this ayahuasca retreat with you. We didn't connect, but I know you know so-and-so. I went to work with Iboga after ayahuasca. And in my journey, I saw a picture of you. I saw a vision of you. I just felt like I should tell you that." So I, on this new opening path, fucking went. And long behold, as soon as I take the medicine, I see myself sitting in Africa on a village with a bunch of African people. I went home, took a genetics test, found out my father's genetics were from Central Africa, Gabon, and dedicated my life to Iboga ever since. Part of that path took me to California Institute of Integral Studies, where I got a second master's on top of my master's in chemistry in East-West psychology, where we learned about soteriology, which is the study of liberation-seeking systems, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, for example. Even Hermetic alchemy can be considered one. And in that, I got introduced to this idea of a liberation, but a liberation from what? Right? They talk about this liberation from suffering, and they say that suffering is rooted in the mind. So when we say, what are we liberating from? We're actually liberating from the mind itself. And that fascinated me. And so I sort of just spent my entire life since then studying that from every dimension I could, from the neuroscience perspective, the spiritual side, from whatever you want to call it. And I've sort of realized that Iboga is a tool for that, for mind transcendence is what I call it. And that's sort of what brought me to this exact moment, having this exact conversation with you, is that overall journey.
Thank you for sharing that. I don't want this whole conversation to be about Iboga, but I've touched upon it on the podcast. Joe's touched upon it when I interviewed her, but because you have this chemist background, I really appreciate the way that you talk about Iboga, combining the chemistry and the spirituality. So can you take a moment to explain what Iboga does for the mind here?
Yeah. So anytime we talk about Iboga, it's always important that we ground with the indigenous tradition behind it. It's the Bwiti people of Central Africa. You can think of the Bwiti as a tree. Yeah. The trunk of that tree is the Masoko. The roots would be the Visumba. And then the various branches would be different traditions like the Fang, the Machogo. There's many different ones, right? So just think of it as a tree with the Bwiti. And so the question is, what is Iboga from a scientific standpoint and what it does to the mind? The easiest way to explain that is an analogy. Let's imagine that you're looking at a brick wall. Yeah. And each of those bricks are a belief that you have about yourself. Something could be as fundamental as my name is Troy, right? That is technically a belief because I could change my name, right? I could say that my name is now Paula and I could change my name to Paula the next day, right? So if each of those bricks is a belief, the question really becomes, what is holding up the bricks? In a brick wall analogy, that's the concrete, correct? Concrete holds up the bricks, so we have this structure. Well, if the bricks are beliefs, psychologically speaking, then what would you call the concrete? And for most people, they'll guess and throw out some stuff, but the true answer is that it's your faith. The bricks are the beliefs, the concrete is the faith. And together they form your mind, which is essentially a rigid structure of beliefs. It might be a belief that Christianity is real. It might be a belief that whatever you want to call it, doesn't really matter.
Calling out the Christians, huh?
Yeah. I mean, I was raised Catholic, so I grew
Yeah,
up
I
with a
was
large
too.
set of beliefs, and we'll talk about one of the beliefs that happens a lot with Christianity and Catholicism in a moment. But
Mm.
just think of this structure that is your mind. So what happens if I remove the concrete from that structure? What would happen to all the bricks, all the beliefs? They would collapse. They crumble down to the ground. Iboga, what it does to the mind is the tool for removing the concrete from the structure. Or to say it a psychological way, it removes the faith from the beliefs. And a lot of us are carrying beliefs that we really didn't choose, right? I had carried a belief that I was a terrible person, not because I was abused, but because I became the abuser when I was 12 and 10, right? When I became the older kid in the home, I played the same games that other kids played with me when I was younger. When I intellectually understood that was wrong at 12, I shamed myself to the point where I couldn't even look in the mirror. In my 20s and 30s, I lived in a house where I would take the mirrors off the wall. I'm not even kidding you, right? All because of a belief that I was a disgusting, a terrible, a horrific, disgusting person. So what Iboga does, it removes the faith from the structure and it allows that structure and beliefs to crumble. And from that crumbling, now we can start to rebuild the structure with the way that we choose to build it, putting the beliefs in our structure that we choose to have there. And when I rebuilt my structure the first time, I chose beliefs that were loving to myself and kind to myself. I am a good person. I am a sweet man. I don't need alcohol to have fun. I put in different beliefs in my life. And so that's really the easiest way to explain what Iboga does. And then biologically speaking, it binds to the various receptors in your brain, produces a state of neuroplasticity. It promotes something called pruning, which is the trimming of your connections, your neurological connections. And so it's literally allowing you to rewire your entire brain. And Joe Dispenza has this old saying, he says that's very true. He says neurons that fire together wire together. Right. And so what we're doing with Iboga is the neurons that have wired together, we're separating those and we're allowing new ones to fire together.
Beautiful. So getting back to, well, actually combining Iboga, because Iboga has this really strong influence on addiction and bringing suffering into that. One of the first things we talked about was the addictions that you see the most. And of course, one of those addictions is suffering. But can you please touch on what the main addictions that you have found in people as during your time working with Iboga?
Yeah. Everybody knows Iboga for its addiction treatment. That's mostly Ibogaine clinics, right? Ibogaine is one specific alkaloid that's extracted from the entire profile of Iboga that's isolated. What they do is they mix that with magnesium and they pump that through you in Ibogaine treatment centers, right? The magnesium helps with the issues, the effects Iboga has on the heart. It almost eradicates that, making it very safe. And so, for addiction speaking, the three primary addictions I see aren't necessary to substances at all. The first one is the suffering, as you alluded to. The second one is the healing. And what I mean by that is people believe that they're not whole, as we talked about earlier. And the third one is along the means of the dopaminergic pathway. There's something that's providing them dopamine that they're addicted to. And the analogy I usually give is cell phones. I need to be quite honest, right? You walk around the world, you can see exactly what that looks like. Everyone's walking with their face in their phone, constantly addicted to it. And it's the dopamine inside of that they're really feeling or missing. When you have your phone down the counter and you're working and all of a sudden you stop what you're doing and pick up your phone and just start scrolling through it, that's the dopamine hit looking to get its little fix right there.
It's a it's a it's a big one to kick. And I could really see all of those things and see them all like suffering's the umbrella and healing and dopamine are underneath because I was reading this book, Dopamine Nation, and she talks about how traditionally in the human mind, what happens is there's conflict, resolution, dopamine. Conflict, resolution, dopamine. But what's happened in this world of ease and accessibility is there's no longer conflict resolution. It's just dopamine, dopamine. But the mind is thinking, wait. Traditionally, we have conflict. So the mind starts to create anxiety and starts to create issues. And I think, growing up where I grew up, there's so many wealthy people and there's a special sickness to that wealth of having anything you want at your fingertips because there's no tension and resolution. And so we create issues to to almost, I guess, for the brain to, I guess, I don't know what's that word to uh, uh I'm at a loss for the word, but to explain why we have so much dopamine. Thinking of like those guys who have like small dicks but big cars. What's that word? They're compensating. The brain's like
That's
compensating.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, they're compensating for something here. So on that line, and I personally, I was addicted to healing and suffering. It was I had to suffer in order to experience the healing because healing feels so good, feels so good to be whole, right? So on that line, and this might be a big question to answer, but why? Why are we, especially in the spiritual community, in the plant medicine community, why are we choosing to suffer so much, you think?
Yeah, that's a really really profound question, and it's something I actually asked myself and in my studies. And I'm halfway through a clinical psychology doctorate program, and so I have spent a lot of time studying different approaches towards helping people. Yeah. And in everything I've studied in my doctorate program, I haven't found a single thing that answers that question as much as the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali does, right? And in the Sutras of Patanjali, he says there are these five things that cause us suffering. Yeah. The first one is the soil in which the other four grow, according to Patanjali, which means that if you can take care of this first one, the other four won't be a problem. So I'll name them and then I'll come back to the first one. The first one is ignorance. Yeah. The second one is egoism. The third is aversion. The fourth is attachment. And the fifth is fear of death. Yeah. And so, like I said, Patanjali, these things are called the kleshas. He says that there's these five kleshas that cause us issues. The only reason that we suffer, according to Patanjali, is because of ignorance. That's it.
Hmm.
And what's an example of that? We walk into a room and it's dusk or dawn or whatever time of the day that it's hard to see as well. And you look down and you see something coiled on the ground and you jump because you think it's a snake, right? And then you look again and you're like, oh, wait, it's not a snake, it's a rope. That's why we suffer. We're just ignorant, is the answer of Patanjali. And if we really look at our lives for a lot of things, you see that's true. And I'll give you an example. When my adopted mother, when I was in college, I might have shared this with you when we were doing our work together, but I think it really applies to this situation. When I was in college, I had this experience where I had a biochem test the next morning. KU had just won the national title, so all my teammates went off to go party in college over in Kansas and Lawrence. I stayed because of this test, and I fell asleep studying. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and I remember grasping my chest, and I was looking around the room, and I'm like, something's wrong. Checked my phone, there was nothing wrong. I looked outside, but as I woke up, I could feel almost like the whole house shake. Tremendous sensation in my chest. And I looked around, there's nothing there. And I fell back asleep. Yeah, no big deal. About 2 hours later, I hear my phone buzzing. I reach out, I grab the phone, I answer, and there's a silence on the phone. I say hello, and it's quiet. I say hello, and I hear this voice come on. It's my cousin Ed. He grew up, my mother took care of him as well. He had some trouble back in the Philippines where my parents were from. And his parents shipped him over to the States to spend time with my mother. She was just a really beautiful woman. And he says, Troy, man, your mom, she's gone. She's dead. And I looked at the phone thinking I was going to wake up. And I sat there for a minute. And at that point, I used to have a lot of lucid dreams. So I thought I was lucid dreaming. So I threw the phone against the wall as hard as I could, and it shattered and it crumbled to the ground. And I remember looking at it, realizing that it's not a dream. And I started yelling, no, 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 as loud as I could, to the point where I fell on the ground and passed out in a state of anguish. Yeah. And to go back to our question, what's interesting about this story is I found out that my mother died twice that night. And this was the spiritual gift in it. The first time, I found out at the level of my heart. The moment her physical body, her spirit left the physical body, there was an energy produced from that, which my heart received. I woke up, I felt it. I looked around, there was nothing there. But who found out the second time? The mind. More specifically, the intellect found out. And what's the first thing the intellect did? It said no, which, according to Patanjali, is aversion. But if you look at it from a broader perspective, it's ignorance of the fact of impermanence. Everyone's going to die. I'm going to pass at some point. You're going to pass. Everyone on this planet is going to pass. Impermanence is a thing. That's why it's a central tenet in the Buddhist teachings. I was ignorant to the truth of impermanence. But if you want to break it down further, I had aversion to my mom being dead. Or you can say I had attachment to her life or what she gave to me, her love, my connection to her. And so it's a really beautiful teaching I received from that, which really taught me that suffering itself is rooted in the mind. Why? Because that no that I yelled in that moment, that no lasted for over 10 years. And I did everything I could, from different sexual partners to alcohol to all the marijuana you can imagine, to traveling, to whatever and you want to name it. I tried it all to try to hide from that no. And it was simply something rooted in my mind.
Yeah. My body feels things with that story. Isn't because we're technically new here, isn't ignorance inevitable? So how is it inevitable? And if it is, isn't suffering sort of inevitable? How do you kind of separate the inevitability or that mindset around it?
Yeah, yeah. Are you familiar with the story of the Buddha?
Somewhat.
So when he achieved his enlightenment, the first lecture he gave was these things called the Four Noble Truths, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first noble truth is the truth of, he's saying that suffering exists, right? He's acknowledging the suffering in life. The second noble truth is the truth of the cause of suffering, which identifies craving and attachment rooted in ignorance as the primary causes. Yeah. The third is the end of suffering, which asserts that by addressing these mental causes, you can end suffering. And the fourth noble truth is the truth of the path to the end of suffering, which he called the eightfold path. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But if we go back to that second one, he's saying, along with these other soteriological systems, that suffering is rooted in the mind. So as long as you are your mind, yes, it is inevitable. It's going to be there. This is why what the work I do with Iboga and the clients I work with, it's about transcendence of the mind itself. There's no other way to escape suffering as long as you are your mind. Mm. And the truth is that you're not. And the sages of India have proven that. They say that there's three realms of existence. There's waking reality, which we are in right now. And we are a point of perception within this reality. And then we fall asleep at night and we transition into this dream world. Yeah. And again, we are a point of perception inside of this reality. Yeah. The Upanishads have different names for this, which we'll talk about once we tell the third one. And the third layer to them is dreamless sleep. And they say in dreamless sleep, this point of perception, which you are, the experiencer, the Atman, the self, or whatever you want to call it, separates from the mind itself. There's nothing there. The Upanishads also say that if you can wake up in this state, separate from the mind, if the experiencer can wake up separate from the mind, you will become who you truly are. So what they're really telling you is there's a roadmap to mind transcendence, being alive, awake, alert in this life without the mind. And so there is a route to it. And that is the central approach that I've taken in my life through my studies and through my work with certain medicines. It's the way that I work with people specifically. Even the stuff we were doing with you is it was that
Mm.
in a nutshell.
Yeah. I I had two memories come up hearing you say that. I took an introduction to Buddhism course when I studied in New Zealand, and it was that second step. I got mad. I was like, what you're telling me that having passion and desire is a bad thing? Like, I love my family so much. Losing them would break me. And I think that's a beautiful thing about life. And it's been so long since I've thought in that way. I think I thought about it, I got angry, and then I just moved on. And yeah, I don't think I necessarily feel that way because I think I understand desire a little bit better now and what it really brings on. And then the other memory that comes in is, and I've said this on the podcast before, one of the best things you could say to me during my Iboga ceremony was the mind is an organ. And I remember I said to you, does it ever stop? And you go, number one, you don't know how, just like your heart, you don't know how to make your heart stop. But number two, you don't want to make it stop either. But just like how you can influence your heart, you can influence your mind. And then you said the mind's tough, like thinks it's tough, rather. It's like those short guys that you grew up with who get a finance degree and they make six figures and they think they're tough. They think they know shit.
Mhm.
So the mind gets ideas. And of course, I remember vividly the image I had of like these guys in little chubby shorts and a tie, shirtless, running
Yeah.
around, being like, "Ah, what am I doing?" And and you said, so when the mind gets ideas, the mind thinks it's tough, but you are not your mind, and you are not your body either. And that is just every time I caught a thought and I was like, oh, this is fucked up. Or I had a memory or experience, I was like, whoa, I'm fucked up. This is big. This is bad. And I was like, wait, that came from my mind though, and I'm not my mind, and I'm not, and that emotion came from my body. I'm not my body. And so I'm starting to these higher concepts. It's so cool how Iboga does that. It makes the simple understandings a lot deeper so that when you are explaining these higher concepts, I have that context there for me.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I remember that very clearly. I was laughing for a little while when you were describing the little dudes popping up.
Yeah.
And obviously, I take a lot of Iboga too when we hold ceremony for people. So when I'm working with someone like I'm with you, it's a very, connected experience. And so sometimes when you describe something, I'll also see it through my third eye, and I also see this little man, and it's an old. I saw him as an old boss I used to work for. Yeah, and so it's there. It's interesting what you said about the thing with your family because going back to the Buddha when he first came out of the Enlightenment, his first teaching really was the middle way. And in Buddhism, this is called Buddha nature. Yeah. And what they say in Buddha nature is here's a perfect example is if you just imagine a dead rose, a flower that's dead, right? Someone gave you some flowers and 2 weeks of sitting on your counter, it's dead, right? Buddha nature would look at that and they say the reason why you see that is ugly is because something is off balance, right? And what do we do with dead flowers? We throw them away, right? The reason you see ugly is because something is off balance, which makes sense intuitively to all of us, right? And then what they would do is they would show you a brand new set of roses you just got. You just put them in your vase and you're like, wow, right in the middle of my house, right? And they would look at that and they would say, okay, and the reason why you see beauty is because something is off balance. And when you hear that, the first instinct is like, what? What do you mean? I see ugly because something's off balance and I see beauty because something's off balance. And you realize that in Buddha nature, this middle way, they don't care about love or hate. It's not about right or wrong. It's not about good or bad. These are all just polarities, and each are off balance. Eckhart Tolle has the same sort of teaching. He calls it the deep eye, transcendental dimension, where you're beyond the polarities of the mind, beyond good or bad. And what I'll do sometimes to give people an experiential understanding of this is I'll invite them. I'll say, all right, next time you take a shower, start your water wherever you like it and close your eyes and start turning the water towards hot or cold, whichever way you want to go. And once you get there, just make a note, open your eyes, make a note where the handle's at, right? And then go back and forth. Do that 3 or 4 times. And what you're going to notice is that point that you call hot and that point that you call cold is going to change because they're not real. They're subjective ideas. They're each just sides of a polarity that exists in this specific world. And so Buddha nature is about finding that middle ground, right? That common space, that balance point. It doesn't mean you can't love someone, and it doesn't mean you can't hate someone. But if we go back to Patanjali's teaching about the kleshas, attachment and aversion are causes of suffering. If you love someone and that person dies, you're probably going to suffer. If you hate someone, you're going to suffer for sure. And so it isn't about not living this life, right? Because love and hate are parts of this life if you choose. It's about living this life from that middle dimension with the awareness of the polarities because they're going to be there. And that itself is transcendence of the mind. It doesn't mean you stop having feelings, right? It does. Nobody wants that. And they're going to happen. It just means that you are the observer of the feelings. You are the experiencer of the feelings. You are not the feelings. That itself is liberation. That itself ends your suffering. And so really the work I do with people is along these lines, and it's very complex. It's a person-to-person situation, person-to-person scenario, but at the end of the day, you can liberate yourself from this mind. And when you do that, the world changes. It becomes a completely different thing. My partner sometimes, who you had on the podcast, he doesn't like when I tell the story, but I'm going to. A lot of the times she'll, if something's going on and like something happens in her life, and she'll come to me and like needs a hug. Yeah. I'll say to her, I won't give you a hug until you hug yourself. Not because I don't care for her and I don't want to be there for her, but because I want her to find that strength in herself, where her mind doesn't have to go outside of itself to find something, some sort of support because it's in there. And these are all the ways we work with people and help people and try to help them find and reestablish that remembrance of who they are, that divinity. And you're the perfect example. I mean, you're someone who, when you talk about this stuff with Iboga and the medicine work we do, you apply it. And I'd be willing to bet your personal life has got better from that.
Oh my God. I mean, the first couple of weeks after Iboga were some of, like, I was telling Mana, they were the happiest I'd ever been, or like the most content I'd ever been, because that mindset around suffering and healing just had shattered. When you had shared the five remembrance with me, that was huge. Um, I guess we can touch on that. It's, we're of the nature of aging, of the nature of dying, of the nature of experiencing ill health. Everything we hold dear and we know, and everyone we know is subject to change, and we are not separate. And then finally, I think it's my action and my word are all that I own, and
The
that's the
ground upon which
foundation.
I stand. Yeah.
Yeah. And especially I'm of the nature to experience ill health. It fixed, it rewired something inside of me. And it's like I can experience all the things and not fall off the deep end and try to figure out what's deeper in it. What's the deeper meaning? I actually, on my phone, I have this background that I had. It's about positive self-talk. And I have since changed it to this quote from Dune. Have you watched Dune?
Love that movie.
Oh, it's epic. So it's about fear. But last night at 4 a.m., I had this panic inside of me because I've had a lot of things in my reality kind of tumble and crumble within the past couple of months since sitting with Iboga. And around 4 a.m. they kind of hit. And so I started going there and I was thinking, ooh, I don't know what this is, but I feel like there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me. And then I looked at my phone to check the time, and then I saw that my background had changed back to positive self-talk. And I was like, oh. here I am again in that old pattern of there's something wrong with me and that's why I'm feeling these things. And it was a really
Yeah.
great reminder there.
Yeah.
Um,
You know what you said something really special. I think that needs to be highlighted. When you talked about the stuff you did with Iboga rewiring something for you, what's actually really happening there is you're curing ignorance, right? You're curing the ignorance of expecting to not have ill health. You're curing the ignorance of expecting to not grow old, right? Like people spend all this money to try to stop themselves from growing old. That's ignorance, right? When you think that you're
yeah.
never going to happen, right? You think that the person you love the most is never going to leave you in some way. It's a state of ignorance. And, you know, what that does to the mind, if we go back to that analogy, is this collapse of that brick wall, that psychic structure from which we form. So when you say something like you did of, I think you used the word, it was tumble and crumble. Things were tumbling and crumbling since Iboga. Exactly. That structure, that brick wall is crumbling. And what's so beautiful about some of these different traditions is they have ways of articulating that, very specially the Toltec people. The author of that book, Four Agreements, Don Miguel Ruiz is a Toltec Nagual. That means a shaman of sorts. A Nagual actual translation is the force that emanates nature, which is it's beautiful if you think about that. But what these Toltec people say is that there's this thing called the dream of the first attention, right? And this is where did you first place your attention? And for us, that's as children. And we are dictated that by our parents, by our religious figures, by our peers in school, by the teachers. All of these different factors place our attention somewhere. And where that attention is placed builds a certain type of structure. Yeah. Then the Toltec people say some very few part of society will get out of that dream of the first attention and enter what you call the dream of the second attention. And the analogy you can give for that is like your structure collapses. Yeah. And now you're building a structure of your own. This is the primary work we do with people. We help them rebuild their own structure, their own belief systems. But if we think about that and we talk about mind transcendence, the question I would ask, well, isn't that still a structure? It's your structure, but it's still a structure. It's still beliefs, right?
Mhm.
And so my query, my approach, my way of work in this life was I asked myself, what if I destroyed that structure? And I did. And then I said, what if I destroyed the structure that builds automatically after that? And what if I kept destroying the structure over and over and over again? And I spent my life since then doing that. And what's interesting is about a year ago, I went down to Teotihuacan and I got to study with Don Miguel Ruiz's two sons, Don Jose and Don Miguel Jr. And we had a week down there with him. It was a really beautiful time. If anyone ever wants to, they do a thing over New Year's Eve. It's phenomenal. Basically, you just spend a week with them going over Toltec teachings. And we were in a group setting, and Don Miguel Jr. was lecturing to everyone. And I asked him about the dream of the first attention. I've studied their books like for years now. And he explained it to the group, and I understood that. And I asked him about the dream of the second attention, the dream of the third. And then I raised my hand and I was like, well, what if you keep destroying the structure? Yeah. Because it's something I've been doing. And I was like, well, what is that? Like, I'm curious your guys' opinion. And Don Jose, who was quiet the whole time, he was sitting down, looking down the whole time as his brother was lecturing. He looked up with these really big eyes. I will never forget it. And he leaned forward and he says, that's what the Nagual does. And in that moment, I understood what I was doing. You see, the shaman, which is just a word, the shaman is constantly dismantling that structure. That is mind transcendence. The mind is going to rebuild its own structure. That's what it does. That's the organ's responsibility. Our job, our work is to constantly dismantle it over and over and over again. So you're structureless. And when that structure's down, on the other side of that structure is the self, the truest version of you, the Atman, the soul, the spirit, the Ka, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't matter. Everyone has their own name for it. But the only thing keeping you from seeing the truest version of yourself is the mind. That's it.
That's deep. I remember last time we spoke, you said to me that you don't have faith in anything. And I've never heard anyone say that before. And it really stuck with me. I think about it all the time. And I would love for you to touch on that. The experience of having faith in nothing and why.
Yeah. So it goes back to the analogy, faith is the concrete that holds up the wall. You need faith for things that faith is a beautiful tool. If you're in the worst situation ever, right? The worst situation, there's no way out. Having faith might be your only lifeline, right? But experience transcends faith. So,
Yeah.
what do I need faith of a religion for when I experience divinity? What do I need faith that I'm going to heal for when I experience my wholeness? Faith is a tool we use in certain situations, but you get to a certain point in your work and your progress in this life or in a life where you don't need it. It's not necessary. And people get offended sometimes when I say I don't have put faith in anything. Why would I? I experience things. And then I have a felt knowing. I have an experientially built understanding of a thing, but no faith. I don't need that. I don't need the structure. There's no point. One of the biggest things I'm trying to remove my faith from, it sounds as silly as you can imagine, is the faith in gravity. Like it sounds silly, but these are the type of things that in my own realm, my own reality, my own creation that I constantly challenge. How do I remove my faith from everything? There's this really wonderful analogy I share sometimes, and I think it will really answer your question of why I really don't use faith, the deeper aspect of it. And it involves self-realization, which to many traditions is what we're really about here, is to realize the self, to see our truest nature. Imagine you're looking in a mirror. Yeah. The face sees the mirror, and the mirror reflects back a version of the face. Yeah. Which is very straightforward. The face is never seeing itself, it's only seeing the reflection of itself, right? Another way to word that is the seer only sees the reflection of itself. Yeah. So if you're brushing your teeth in the morning and you get a brand new electric toothbrush like I just got that I didn't know how to use, and you used to turn it on too early and it sprays toothpaste all over the mirror. Yeah. And you look in the mirror, what is it going to happen to the reflection of your face?
It'll be obstructed.
It'll be obstructed. But because we have the intellect, this discernment faculty in our minds, we know that that toothpaste isn't on us, right? We know that it's not there. So we can either wipe off the toothpaste or we can leave it there and not care. Yeah. In the same way that a face sees the mirror and the mirror reflects back a version of the face, the self, the soul, the Atman, sees the mind. And the mind reflects back a version of the self, the Atman, the soul. The difference is that faculty doesn't have the intellect. And so if there's toothpaste on the mind, the Atman sees itself with toothpaste, a distortion. And so what does the Atman try to do? It tries to wipe the toothpaste off its own face, but it's not there. So you'll spend your entire life trying to do that over and over again to no avail because it's not on you, it's on the reflection of you. That's what healing is.
Right.
Healing,
Oh,
healing is that, which is why the first thing on our website, when you go to our website, runewisdom.com, the first thing we're going to tell you, this isn't about healing, it's about remembering. And this is exactly why. So when you ask why I don't have faith, faith is the thing that holds up the obstructions. It's the thing that allows the toothpaste to even be on the mirror.
I hear you. It something clicked for me hearing that. Hmm.
Basi. Basi means truth for anybody who doesn't know.
Bossy. mentioning the Don Luis Miguel and the Toltecs, can you please, because another thing that you taught me that was big is the four enemies. And I think that is
Yeah.
very intrinsic to letting go of suffering. So can you please and letting go of ignorance too. So yeah, please touch on that for us.
Yeah. So those actually come from the Carlos Castaneda books.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so if anyone hasn't read the Castaneda books, they're amazing. And Carlos Castaneda was an anthropologist essentially who some people don't believe it's true, but he went to Mexico. He met a Yaqui Indian who was a medicine man of sorts, and this guy started apprenticing him. And the books are the transcriptions of his journey. And in one of the books, Don Juan, who is the quote unquote shaman, he is telling Carlos Castaneda about this thing to become a man of knowledge or a man of wisdom. It could be a woman of wisdom too. So just a word, yeah. And Carlos Castaneda is constantly asking, like, oh, what is it? How do you become this? And so Don Juan finally tells him, and he says, in order to become a man of knowledge or a man of wisdom, you have to defeat the four enemies. Yeah. The first of the four enemies is fear. And he says that fear is what stops the majority of men in their tracks. Something comes along that they're too afraid to go beyond. They're too afraid to face. They're too afraid to understand, whatever it is. And fear stops the majority of people. They'll never get past fear, is what he says. And so Castaneda says, well, how do you get past fear? And Don Juan says, the trick is you don't get past it, you become it. And that's a really beautiful insight if you think about something, because oftentimes we have something coming up in our lives and we want to get rid of it. Oh, I don't want to feel this way. Well, what if you became that feeling and invited it into you in every aspect of you? Then their feeling wouldn't technically be there anymore, right? There's the observer and the observed. Well, what if the observer and the observed become one? Then there is no more observed. And therefore, the feeling itself is gone. So what Don Juan's really saying is to merge the observer and the observed, to allow those two to become one. And in that, there is no more fear. You've transcended it in a way. And then he says, and once you get past fear, people think, oh, I've conquered my fears. Now I'm somebody. And he says, this is where they run into the second of the four enemies, which is clarity. Yeah, another word I could say for it is knowledge. They think they know everything. They think they know the ways of the world. They think they have it all figured out. And he says this blinds people because the truth is we know nothing. It's either Socrates or Aristotle. He has that famous quote thing, as for me, all I know is I know nothing. Well, that is a deep, deep, deep concept to contemplate. And he says the only way to get past clarity is to realize that you know nothing, which, by the way, is essentially what we're doing with this art of mind transcendence. It's the focus on clarity. Yeah. And then he says, once people get past clarity, now all of a sudden, because they've conquered those two enemies, the world starts to conform around them. They're able to manipulate the world, and guess what they have? Power. And he says, look around at all the great leaders, especially all the great men, you'll see exactly why power is an enemy. And the reason the power is the next enemy is because men think and people think that the power is theirs. And so they manipulate it, they abuse it. And we see that story run rapid, especially through the medicine space. Yeah. People using their power to justify their greed, justify their addiction, justify their leaky sexual energy, whatever it could be. They're using this power for these ways that it's not intended. And so he says, well, how do you get past the power? And he says the secret to remember the power, how to get past power, is to remember that it's something that moves through you. It's not yours. It was never yours. It's just something that's transitioning through you. And what's so interesting about that one is if you were to do a specific type of esoteric meditation, they use this thing called the Great Invocation before they start. And it's called a transmission meditation. And what you essentially do on a certain night of the week, people all over the world will get together. They'll use a specific invocation, the Great Invocation. And what they'll do is for 3 hours, they'll stare at their third eye center with their eyes closed while holding a wire that connects to a tetrahedron. And the belief is that when you do this, you allow this specific power to move through you into the tetrahedron, which makes it usable for the spirit, the high spirit masters on this earth to channel it to help change the world for the better. There's a global group called the Transmission Meditation Group. I've been a part of for a long time that does this. And it's an act of service and a way to evolve your soul at the same time.
Hmm.
And so what he's really talking about in these four enemies is this power that moves through us, not letting it stick, just letting it go all the way. It's why you ask me, what label do I have for myself? If I say I'm a medicine man, there's an attachment to that, something sticking with me. I won't do the labels. I'm not. It's just not happening. And so he says that's how you get past the third enemy. And at this point, Kasane is like, well, what's the last one? Because he, right, like what else could it be? And he says the fourth one is old age. And what's so interesting about old age is that there's only one way to beat it. And he says the only way to beat old age is to constantly battle the first three enemies over and over and over and over and over and over again for your entire life. And if you always beat those three over and over again, on your very last breath, you will have become a man of knowledge. And to me, that defines not a man of knowledge, but what it actually means to be of selfless service to other people. You constantly do it over and over and over again to your last breath. And in that moment, you become that person. Mother Teresa did that. She took care of people her entire life over and over and over again until her very last breath, until she literally gave out her heart. And that's what we remember her for. All the great leaders and teachers who have graced this planet have done the same thing. They were essentially man and wisdom of knowledge because they, maybe not necessarily the three enemies, but they did their service until their very last breath. And in that breath is when you become it. And that's the most beautiful part about it to me.
Feels like it's a last breath of transcendence, you know?
I see.
Hmm. Just some good stuff, some good stuff. Well, speaking of service, I would love for you to touch on your program that you have been developing that is kind of based on all of this stuff that we've been talking about.
Mhm. Yeah, so the program we're actually running, my partner and I, is about mind transcendence. Yeah, we have a different word for it. We call it a neuro spiritual empowerment program. It's a nice little like a name for it. Um, but the essential tenet of this program is have you heard of the word Vedanta?
Mm-mm.
So Vedanta is a word you'll find in the Hindu tradition. If you break it down to the subsequent parts, there's Veda and Anta. Veda means the end of, and Anta means knowledge. So together, Vedanta is the end of knowledge itself, right? And so what we're really doing in this program is we are helping people to gain an awareness of what the mind actually is, and more importantly, what the mind is not. Right? And through this awareness, things in your life will start to shift. Things that were once problems will fall away. Those five kleshas we talked about, you'll start to have more awareness of how you're suffering from one of those five kleshas. And as you stay sustained in this practice over time, what happens is that brick wall of your mind starts to crumble. And as it crumbles, you can see over it. And what's on the other side is the truest version of yourself. And so, what we're really doing in its core, which sounds like a very lofty goal, is we're picking up the work of self realization through the technique of mind transcendence. And Iboga is simply one tool we use in this process. It's an amazing tool for that, but it's not necessary. You can build a house without a hammer. It might take you a little longer, it might be a little more difficult, but there's a lot of indigenous people who do that, and their houses last for a very long time. And you can use a hammer. And so the question is what tools suit you? And so what we do is we work with individuals and find out the tools that are best for them. Now, in Iboga, we also have a dieta program we help people move through. Should people dieta where you go into the Amazon for 2 weeks and diet a specific plant? There's a whole thing, which, yeah, you know. And so, yeah, that's what our program is in a nutshell. It's assisting people in a process of self-realization. Because from what I've seen is I can help you with your trauma. I can sit there and talk to you. I'm in a clinical psychology doctorate program. Like we can do IFS, we can do cognitive behavior therapy. We can do it all. But all we're doing is spinning in circles inside of the same source of the suffering, which is the mind, according to the Buddha and all these soteriological systems. And so, yeah, this program is about how to transcend the mind. And then what happens after that, you get to experience that for yourself. But I can tell you in my own life, um, I've never really felt the purity and essence of this life before I really started doing this type of work. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the people we work with are seeing it too. And it happens. It's not something that happens tonight. I mean, for some it does, but it's a work you do, a way of living. It's literally a way of being that you were teaching. And in that way of being, you find your liberation.
I see. It makes me think of, and Joe, she said the word, but I want to say it here with you is it's not the integration, it's the integrated living.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do have two closing questions that I ask everybody. Before we get into it, is there anything else that you feel like within this topic that needs to be shared?
Yeah, there's one thing I think I can share that I think will really be helpful. And it's probably the easiest way to do this work we're talking about, because some people might be listening and say, well, it sounds like a lot, it sounds like this and that. It's really not that much, but even if that is where your belief is at right now, there's one passage from the Upanishads which I think is important to read, and it says a man, but it could be a man or a woman. So I'm just putting that out there. When a man performs actions clinging blindly to his lower desires, then his actions bind him to the plane of ignorance or the plane of birth and death. But when the same actions are performed with surrender to God, they purify and liberate him. And the reason I share this is because my father currently is toward the end of his incarnation. He's in a home right now where he's just living full time, and who knows how long he has left. And I was in San Diego recently, and I was taking care of him inside the home. I was helping him to the bathroom and washing him and all those things. And I went to help him to the restroom, and I walked over to try to pick him up, and my body locked up on me, like somatically locked. And in that exact moment, this passage from the Upanishads came through my head. And I realized in that moment, I was helping my father up, which is fine. But what was actually transitioning inside of me was is asking me to switch, not to help my father up, but to help the God within my father up. Yeah. And so I share that with everyone because whatever you're doing in this life, even if it doesn't matter what it is, but if you can start to do it for the God within that thing, your life will change. Even if you just did that, if you go get a glass of water because you're thirsty, but what if you got a glass of water for the God within yourself? Even if it's just a belief in your mind, if you started living like that, your life will transform in a way you do not believe. And so I just want to share that as an offering to all of you because it is a real one. And it's very, very simple to do. And all you have to do is just say it. I'm going to eat this damn cookie for the God within myself. And eat the damn cookie.
Let that cookie taste and feel good. God, that I just recorded a podcast on the experience of betrayal, and with that comes, the experience of forgiveness if you choose it. But I started talking about how like transcending forgiveness in a way of not forgiving because for that lower self, forgiving for the God within is why are you forgiving? Is it to place judgment and say like you were wrong, but I am magnanimous enough to give you my forgiveness? Or are you forgiving because you want to let go and you're here to learn and you're here to see what's on the other side of it?
Yeah. Yeah. Forgiveness is one of the biggest ones. I mean, not forgiving someone is essentially drinking a poison and expecting them to die,
Yeah.
right? That's really what it is. And we could measure your biochemistry of your blood today and see that it's a more acidic environment when you hold animosity or hate towards somebody than you do if you forgive them. So at the end of the day, forgiveness is liberation of your own self from suffering.
Yeah. Hmm. Cool. Well, my last two questions is because food therapy is a huge part of Chinese medicine. It's been a huge piece of my life, and I love to To learn from others. I would love to know about a food, an herb, some sort of nourishing substance that's been a big part of your journey of nourishment and returning to center.
Yeah, I mean, probably the most nourishing thing is when I started Qigong, just how I nourish my body with prana. But if we're
Mm.
talking about foods specifically, um, there's this, I don't know what you call it, like a protein mix, whatever you want to call it. There's this brand called Kachava.
Oh
I
yeah.
don't know if you've heard of them.
Yeah.
I have been using them for years, and what I found what's so beautiful about them is I don't have to eat 3 meals a day. I use kachava in the morning. I have a lighter middle day lunch and then a lighter early dinner. And as you know, the more you eat, the more your metabolic rate increases. And so the less you eat, basically the less you age. Your metabolic rate is related directly to your age. And so you'll actually prolong your life simply by reducing the amount of meals you have in a day. And kachava was the one thing I found that really allowed me to do that with a pretty much vegan diet. It's amazing. And so that would be the one thing I recommend. And I'm not a paid sponsor for them either. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah. I was gonna say free sponsorship for Kachava.
Yeah.
All right. And my last question, you could share to whatever depth you're comfortable with, but I would love for you to share a pearl that you have received or discovered while moving within a recent darkness that you can be currently in it or you can be on the other side of it. I know you shared a lot of pearls, but one last one.
A recent pearl through a thing of darkness. Yeah. I think there's one thing I can tell you. I actually have the book right by me. It's actually a sutra, if I may read it to
Mm,
close.
please.
Um, it's called the Kama Sutra, not Kama Sutra like the sexual stuff. It says, do not believe on the strength of traditions, even if they have been held in honor for many generations and in places. Do not believe anything because many people speak of it. Do not believe on the strength of sages of old times. Do not believe that which you have yourself imagined, thinking that a God has inspired you. Believe nothing which depends only on the authority of your masters and priests. After investigation, believe that which you have yourself tested and found reasonable, and which is for your good and that of others. It's from the Buddha, called the Kama Sutra. So that would be the one gem is don't believe in anything.
I think that is very useful and relevant, especially for being an election year.
Bossy to that.
All right, Troy, how can people find you? Is there anything? This will probably be out in probably like a month or so. Because I have quite a few interviews that I'm sitting on, but if you want to share anything that's maybe happening towards the end of this year, if you want, or just sharing simply how people can find you.
Yeah. So I have a personal website which I do my one-on-one coaching with called Authentic Empowerment. It's just authentic-empowerment.com. Or if you Google my name, Troy Valencia, it should pop up. And then my partner and I have Root and Wisdom, which is our Iboga website. We run retreats out of Costa Rica, Colombia, um, some other places which I probably shouldn't name on the air for legality reasons. But if you go to our website, you can see where we're hosting retreats. Um, and yeah, the last one is through social media on Instagram. It's the Soul Integrator is my name.
Beautiful. All right.
Mhm.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So grateful to have you on the show. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support this podcast, Please give this episode a share, leave your rating, review, and make sure that you're subscribed for next week's episode. If you would like to work with Troy, your reminder, all of his information is in the show notes. If you would like to work with me, you can find all of my information in the show notes as well.